It's 4 o'clock, so we'll get started. Thank you all for joining us for our first Zoom poster session ever. We have 8 students who are going to present today, and I've asked them all to talk for 3 to 5 minutes, and then we'll have time for 1 to 2 questions per student. I want to try and make sure we get through everyone by 5. Is there anyone out there who would like to volunteer to go first?
Oh, I can go first.
Thanks, Calvin.
Someone else wants it.
Thanks, Calvin.
All right, so I'll go first then. Let me just full screen this bad boy here. Just thinking about it. There we go. So this is going to be kind of an exploration, and we'll figure out how to do this because I've never done this before. So this is a poster about the 3rd chapter of my thesis. So it's about Chinese tallow's response to prescribed fire in upland pine stands and lowland hardwood stands. So the objective of this study is to evaluate the effect of prescribed fire on Chinese tallow in lowland hardwoods and lowland hardwood stands and upland pine stands in Beaufort, South Carolina. So Chinese tallow is native to China. It's invasive throughout the southeastern United States. It was likely introduced in the late 1790s, and it has been spread across the southeast since then. It can outcompete most native vegetation in both full sunlight and full shade conditions, and after outcompeting them, it creates a monoculture of just Chinese tallow. The current management strategies that are successful for are the applications of herbicides and then physical removal of individuals. Both of these processes can be incredibly expensive and time consuming. And so we're hoping to find a better way and build a better mousetrap here. So to study this, we found 5 lowland hardwood stands and 5 upland pine stands. So we get 10 stands total in Beaufort, South Carolina. We're working on Nemours plantation. Inside of those stands, we put up 4 transects in parallel. They're all separated by 10 meters and they're all 50 meters long. So on the right side of each one of our transects, we went through and we tagged all of the Chinese tallow within 5 meters of the transect. And we took a couple of measurements on them. We don't have time to talk about those now. So we're just gonna tell you we tagged them. And then we burned those those stands in the growing season. So that's starting in March and then going all the way through till September. We burned in late March and then late May. We couldn't burn all the stands together just due to weather. So we had a little bit of delay between the 2 burns. And then following our burns, we went back out. We found our tagged Chinese tallow and we recorded whether they were top killed. And so that means the initial stem that we had tagged was dead. And if they had stump sprouted, so there was like little guys coming out from the stump, or if they had not stump sprouted, we assumed they were just totally dead. So here's a nice little figure about what we found. So in total, we observed 540 Chinese tallow. Also, we removed any Chinese tallow from the study that we were unable to find on our follow-up work. We removed them so that we didn't artificially inflate mortality statistics. It is possible that some stems could have been totally consumed. However, we didn't really find just any tags laying on the forest floor. We did lose some stems though, just because vegetation grows really dense after prescribed fire. So we just removed those from the study. All right, anyway, so we started with a total of 540 Chinese tallow. 494 of them were in our upland pine stands. And after our prescribed fire, only 1 of them survived. So we top killed 99.92% of the stems, which is really great, really good. We only managed to totally kill, we only managed to cause mortality in 41 or 8% of the stems, and then the rest of them stump sprouted. And then they had a median number of 4 stump sprouts per stem. But these stump sprouts tended to be smaller than the initial stem. So we managed to kill some of them and then knock pretty much all of them back except for 1 guy that managed to escape. Now going over to our lowland hardwoods side, we started out with 46 individuals. We had 10 of them survive the prescribed fires and the rest were top killed. So we had 78% top killed and 22% survive. We had about 25% of our top killed stems were totally killed. So there's pretty good mortality there. And then, then about 3/4 of them stump sprouted, and they had a median number of 2 stem sprouts per stem. So overall, what we can conclude is that prescribed fire is a really good way to set back Chinese tallow. The mortality is low from prescribed fire, but it does top kill all of the stems, which can be very handy if you're trying to just push Chinese tallow back in its size and allow native vegetation to compete and maybe outcompete Chinese tallow. I would say that the burns were more effective at controlling Chinese tallow in the upland pine stands, and that's supported by statistics. 99% versus 78%. The upland pine stands are way better to burn. Also, we had 2 burns fail. So like we tried to burn and they didn't start in the pine stands, and so we had to remove those stands from our study. So it can be pretty difficult to conduct prescribed fire in the lowland hardwood stands. This is likely due to high moisture, soil moisture found in lowland hardwood stands. We found a lot of switch cane in our lowland hardwood stands. Switch cane is an indicator of soil moisture. We didn't take any measures of soil moisture, but using our indicator species, we can conclude that there's a high, likely a higher soil moisture in our pine stand, in our lowland hardwood stands. Also, about 10% of the overstory in the lowland hardwood stands was live oak, and live oak, the leaf litter from live oak tends to suppress fire. It doesn't burn as hot, and it's harder to ignite. So, that makes it harder to burn in those stands. As a control method, if you can conduct prescribed fire in either stand, it works very well. As you can see here, we killed a lot of Chinese tallow, and now we have little blue stem coming back. So when you can burn, prescribed fire works great as a control method for Chinese tallow. However, it can be difficult to conduct prescribed fire in lowland hardwood stands. We want to see what these stems look like after a year. Our follow-up was only after 4 months. Unfortunately, this whole COVID-19 thing has kind of set back our follow-up studies. So I was supposed to go down 2 or 3 weeks ago to do that follow-up work, but we're locked up inside. So hopefully we'll get to go down there. We also monitored the responses from our native vegetation, and I've done some work on looking at the response of that, but it's not the room that's supposed to show that. Yeah, and that was the study.
Thank you, Calvin. I think we have time for one quick question if anyone has one. And you can also use the chat feature if you prefer. No questions, Calvin. Perfect presentation. Do we have another volunteer? Okay, Keith, can you go?
Yes, I can go.
Thank you. I'm just gonna go down the list. Ellie, you're next, just so you know.
Oh, see here.
You're okay, Tiny. You're okay.
What's going on here? Sorry, y'all. One more time.
Do you want me to skip you for a second?
Yeah, no, it was working last time. Let's see. It might just be having trouble with trying to make it full screen. But
so yeah, that looks fine.
Just like as here?
Well, can you make it full screen? That's when it messes up.
Yeah, let me see.
So just click up because it's like it's not starting from the first screen, first slide.
There we go. Okay, I guess I'll just keep it here. So, welcome to my poster presentation, everybody. So to start off with the introduction and kind of like where our project is going, we're really concerned with trying to find ideal units for restoration in the southern Blue Ridge Escarpment within Jocassee Gorges. So our restoration units primarily would be places that would have fire-dependent habitat historically, but through various means are now becoming degraded. One of the big drivers of this degradation of fire-dependent habitat is mesification, or the encroachment of mesic-loving species such as yellow poplar, mountain laurel, red maples, and rhododendrons. Some other concerns that we have are high grading, or the unsustainable harvesting of valuable hardwoods that was rampant in the 20th century, and fire suppression. And all of these factors have combined in order to essentially limit the amount of oak regeneration and yellow pine recruitment within the southern Blue Ridge. So what we want to do is to develop an ArcGIS map that ultimately delineates forest stands and burn units that are ideal candidates for restoration activities or harvesting activities. And ultimately, we want to create an image that rates all of Jocassee Gorges on a scale of 0 to 4 for habitat departure, and 0 would be low habitat departure, and 4 would be a high habitat departure. And we want to combine that with some operability indices, which would essentially be how difficult it is to harvest in stands to create a final scale of 1 to 7 for ultimate restoration or restoration prioritization. So 1 would be a good area to restore, and 7 would be not so good. So to do this, besides GIS work, we also conducted habitat surveys, and will be doing that in the summer of 2020. So from our preliminary habitat surveys that we did in 2019, on average, on a per plot basis, we're seeing that the basal area has a lot of fire species present on a per plot basis. So our fire species are just lumped categories of oaks, pines, and hickories, whereas our mesic species groups are red maple, tulip poplar, hemlocks, white pine, black gum, and red maple. However, in the mid-stories and in our tree regeneration layers, we're ultimately seeing that mesic species are predominating in these layers, which suggests to us that unfortunately, while the overstory may be what we want to attain, the understory and the mid-story in the future will not represent a lot of those fire-associated habitats that we're ultimately concerned with managing. So for our preliminary results, suggests that with repeat burning and with better targeted approach to restore some of these areas, we can ultimately come out with a better methodology to save time, resource, and energy for the staff at Jocassee Gorges. However, we do need a lot more data to follow up in our 2020 field season to really round out our approach and to conduct and to get as much data as we can for the entire Jocassee Gorges. And so our next phases of the project will be to collect that habitat data to inform our habitat departure index model, and to also combine that with our harvest operability model to have our final output that the managers in Jocassee Gorges can use. So that is a quick rundown of where we've been and where we plan to go. And if anybody has any questions, I would love to answer them.
I have a question. Your project, you're making a map, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what, and it's about like you're separating habitat types out or something, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So this map that you have on your post right now is these ecological zones. Like what's your end product going to be that's different from what this one is? That was not
Yeah.
a very well-worded question.
That's a great question. So the map that you see is actually, there was work that was done from the Nature Conservancy and the U.S. Forest Service that delineated habitat zones across the entire southern Blue Ridge Escarpment. So that's kind of like what we're basing our models off of. But ultimately where we want to go is to kind of like on a stand level to look at like percent coverage of the habitat zones that we're concerned with. So essentially fire dependent habitat zones, which would be some of the examples would be like a shortleaf pine community or like an oak pine heath community. And we're just look at like the proportions of each stand and informed with those habitat surveys that we did, we're going to come up with like a numerical rating for that stand. And then we'll just like, it'll be like a hodgepodge of all those numerical ratings that we'll use for the GIS. Thea's making fun of me for my hand movement.
No, okay, that makes a lot more sense, because when you're talking about making a map about organizing habitats, I'm like, I think I'm looking at what you're talking about, and I don't get it. Cool, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, Ellie, you will go now, and then Jeremy, just so you know, you'll be next.
Okay, let me figure this out. Also, I live with a cat and a puppy and a roommate, so all bets are off as far as how background noise could go. So it'll be fine. There might be something that screams in the background every once in a while. Okay, so hello, I'm Ellie Johnson, and so my project is called Longleaf Pine Ground Cover Restoration in the Wiregrass Gap. Seed source is local best, and I'm working with Dr. Thea Hagen, who you all know and love, and then Dr. Patrick Hiesel and Dr. Joan Walker, and we're collaborating with the Historic Camden Society, and we're working to restore the Camden Battlefield and Longleaf Pine Preserve to its historic landscape of Longleaf Pine Savanna. So what's currently there, here's a little map of the site down here in the bottom left. So right now the whole site is made up of mostly loblolly plantation, that's the pink, and then the yellow is mixed hardwood pine species. And it was thinned back in 2017. Also, I'm pretty sure my roommate is singing right now, and I'm so sorry. So I don't have the time to focus on the canopy. They've got a forest manager for that. So I'm focusing on the understory, where I'm trying to reinstate a little blue stem population, which is the bunch grass of this area, that is responsible for carrying the surface fires characteristics of a longleaf pine savanna. So what I'm testing is I'm comparing two different seed sources. Let's move up this way into our methods. Comparing two different seed sources. So we've got a commercially produced seed source. It's by this company called Roundstone, and it's what the forest manager that works for the site, his name's Coy Myers, he's great. He was just gonna order some seeds online and broadcast them out on the site. I don't know if that's a good idea, so we're gonna compare those commercially produced seeds, because those might be a different ecotype, to locally collected seeds that me and Thea collected last fall. We are also comparing 3 different site preparation techniques. Disking or digging into the ground to negate above and below ground competition, raking to negate above ground competition, or just leaving the area undisturbed. And just to see if either the sources are better and there's more survival and establishment of low blue stem seedlings, or if any of those techniques are helpful for survival. I'm hypothesizing that locally collected seed is going to be more successful in the space because it has evolved with the local environmental conditions. And I think disking would be the best site prep technique to negate any competition. So here's some of the stuff that we did. I set up these different grids. There's 5 of them out there right now. Each grid has 2 control. They're randomly generated as far as where treatment combos are placed. So 2 of the plots in each grid are blank controls just to see what comes up. And then the other 6 plots of each grid are one of the treatment combos. So one of the seed sources with one of the site prep techniques. We ran this experiment last year, and so here's a comparison of like this year's experiment setup and last year's. Last year I did my best, but we didn't have a lot of germination because I put a grid out just by itself, and it was kind of they were set up along a forest line, and I feel like I just put out a bunch of little buffets for little animals to come and eat thousands of little seeds. So this year, with the help of Hazel with some of his power tools and a whole lot of very good humans, we built these little animal exclosure boxes to hopefully keep out some small seed herbivores. And then also, if you see, there are these really snazzy milk jugs turned upside down, and that, ladies and gentlemen, is an irrigation system on a budget. And so hopefully between those two things, we have much higher numbers, because this graph down here is my numbers from last summer. And they're comically low, like the most that any treatment combination, the establishment that I have is 14 or less, which is very pitiful if you think that I planted thousands of seeds out there, because they're very tiny. So hopefully this year, with like considering watering and keeping things out, I'll have more data to talk about, and so it'll be a much more interesting story. Some next steps and management application. I'm also conducting, well, I guess not right now because I can't access the greenhouse very often, but I am going to be doing a greenhouse study to compare the growth habits of both seed sources, because I have a hunch that that they develop differently, that I think maybe the local seed collected at Camden would put more energy in developing its root systems, because it's a very sandy environment out there. Also want to help with developing environmental education programs for the Camden area, because this is not the only longleaf pine restoration that's happening out there. Hardscramble is like 5 miles away from my site, and they're doing similar adventures. Jacob will talk to you about that next week. But then also to analyze, I was doing soil and veg surveys in the summer, and so to take that data and to try to provide some guidance for next steps with this restoration process. To highlight some very cute pictures, like I said, Hazel's sawing away right here. We got a small animal exclosure in its natural habitat. These are all these different good people that have been helping me out. And I have some field cams out there this year, and so this is a very curious family. I've got like 30-some photos of them because they hung out in these boxes way too long. It's boxes and milk jugs. I don't know what they were looking for, but it's kind of cute. And all these acknowledgements on the bottom if you want to read more stuff that's adorable. Does anyone have any questions? I can't see everybody. No? Good?
Okay, we can also take questions at the end if people think of something as we move along, just to keep things going. Let's go ahead and have Jeremy share. And Sam, you will be after Jeremy.
Which screen is sharing? Can you see it now?
We see your Zoom screen, not.
Oh. Better?
Not yet, but sometimes there's a lag. There it is. Yes, your poster's there, but it's not very big. There, it's getting bigger.
Good now.
Yeah, it's not full screen, but if you've done something to do that, you can go ahead and start talking. It'll probably.
1 second. Okay. Sorry about that.
Okay, it's loading
Okay.
now. So I'll let you go.
Okay, well, my name is Jeremy Dertine. I'm a PhD candidate with Rob Baldwin.
Most of my work is actually centered around the Congaree National Park and the Congaree Biosphere, but this was a project on a much broader scale looking at water cover and species richness in the coterminous United States. And so we know there are limited studies on how wetland cover and species richness correlate to each other, and most of the ones that we have are more on a local scale of a dozen, maybe 20 different studies, and they've shown mostly mixed results with some correlation to cover and species richness being positive. So to undergo this analysis, we first took all the National Wildlife Wetland Inventory in the United States from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and combined all of them to create a map of all the wetlands of the United States, about a 100 gigabyte feature file, and then turned those into points and then created actually a wetland cover map for the conterminous United States. We then took species richness data from Jenkins et al. Paper that has some pretty awesome species richness maps for the US and then also for the entire world. And we used a Bayesian spatial Poisson model to actually estimate a spatially varying wetland coefficient. So this is pretty cool because compared to like a normal generalized mixed model, linear mixed model, where coefficients can't vary in space, this actually allows us to have different beta estimates over space. And so we can see how the relationship between species richness and wetland cover can vary over space. And so we were expecting that there would be a sort of continental scale relationship between species richness and wetland cover. And what we actually found, if you look in the center, there's 10 total maps. The ones on the left are the beta coefficient, so that's the magnitude of effect of wetland cover on and species richness. And then on the right is if it was positively or negatively statistically significant. And so not too surprisingly, birds and amphibians were more positively significantly related to wetland cover and less so for mammals and reptiles. But the thing that really started to show up was that there was more of a tie to specific ecoregions rather than this continental scale relationship. So that was a pretty interesting findings for us specifically because one, in further analysis we did with the National Land Cover data set, we found that there was between 2011 and 2001, almost 500,000 less hectares of wetlands in the United States, and several of these were actually within these most important ecoregions for species richness and wetland cover. And so going forward, it really points out the need for conservation initiatives more at an ecoregion scale rather than at either a state or full national scale. And then also there's a lot to build on from this study because species richness is a pretty general measure. And so building on that using other more detailed biodiversity measures can really elucidate interesting findings. So I tried to run through that pretty quickly, but if there's any questions, I would be happy to answer them.
Okay. I encourage you guys to think of questions too, and we can save them to the end and open it up for questions for everyone, for any poster that you've seen today at the end of the time. But for now, since I don't see anything, we're going to go ahead and move on to Sam's. Thank you, Jeremy. And Trish, you are after Sam.
Great, thank you, Dr. Hagan. Everyone see that?
Yep.
Great. So building off of Jeremy's presentation with spatial analysis, my name is Sam Cheplik. I'm a master's student with Marzi Motalevi. Our lab does a lot of spatial kind of metrics and other evaluations, but for my poster, I'll be looking at the eastern oyster in terms of its catch per unit effort and harvesting closures that are taking place in Charleston County. So that is my study area. And just going into the methods really quickly, the different spatial layers I used were derived from Department of Natural Resources, SCDNR. They provided me with aerial photography of oyster beds that were taken between 2003 and 2006. These images were, of course, taken at low tide, mean low tide, so they could actually get the parameter, the extent of those oyster beds. And then from there, I was able to get total landings and effort data that is collected through landing receipts, again, through SCDNR. And that was between 2003 and 2019. So this study is just spatially explicit. I didn't really capture the temporal aspect, but that was also coupled with a spatial layer that Department of DHEC, Department of Health and Environmental Control provided for me, which looks at the actual areas that are closed due to elevated bacterial levels. Again, this is within just Charleston County. So to determine the extent, you're probably looking at the left side, it actually uses the USGS quad index. So that actually is giving me an ability to have neighboring effects from one grid to the next, and the grids are approximately 10 kilometers squared. And from there, the analysis that I ran used something called a spatial autoregressive model. And that's looking at each cell's and the neighboring effect within each cell and determining if there is significance and if it's spatially autocorrelated. In the results section here, I was able to produce some general rasters, and those are looking at the extent of where you're seeing the harvesting closures and then also the density of oyster beds in those areas. And then through the spatial regression that I ran, you're actually able to visually see how catch per unit effort varies across the entirety of Charleston County, as well as the density of harvesting closures, which you can notice is actually a little bit higher towards Charleston, the city itself, which makes sense. And going off of that, what this analysis really is showing is that CPUE may have a larger, elevated catch per unit effort may have a larger net effect on overall population density of eastern oyster than the area of the harvesting closures. So that's what the preliminary data is showing in Charleston County. But one of the biggest parts of this that SCDNR is doing is site-specific analysis of life history metrics. So they want to look at site-specific mortality, also survivorship, to actually ground truth. If analyses like this are capturing which perturbation or which issue is large with these populations. So this is kind of a template or groundwork to then work off of with actual field studies to accomplish that goal. And I'll have any questions if anyone has it.
Do we have to wait for questions till the end? Because I have one right
No, I think we're doing okay on time. You can go ahead.
now. Hi, Sam. Just over on the right side of your poster, the spatial regression stuff. Because the axis is really small.
Yeah.
What exactly are we looking at with some of the colors on there?
Yeah. So this is so if you're looking at the density in that area, it was actually taken with 9 by 9 meter squared, basically like pixel size. So that's actually saying within those 9 meter square pixels what the density is for the like aerial photography that was taken. So it's actually able to give estimates of that density, but then also it's looking at where, based on the raster, where the hotspots are from there. And again, that's at the 9 meter resolution size. So that's kind of where it's capturing that. I don't know if that fully answered your question, but.
No, that does. It was just, I was trying to look through those. I'm like, I can't read.
Yeah, no, it's.
So, no, I'm sorry, but thank you.
Yep.
You can also feel free to use the chat box at the bottom of your screen to type in questions, and we might answer those for any poster, not just for Sam's that you've seen, so that we can use that as a place to start at the end of everyone presenting. Thank you, Sam. And I guess we'll let Trish go now, and then Chip, you will be after Trish.
All right, so hi, I'm Trisha Marcus. I'm working with Dr. Jeff Wrong and Dr. Lauren Powell with the Forest Service. What I'm doing is I'm actually making seasonal light response curves of Chinese privet. So Chinese privet is a highly invasive shrub or tree, whatever the hell you want to define it as. And what we're doing is we're trying to test this extended leaf phenology. So extended leaf phenology is you've got a plant who can actually leaf out earlier in the spring or keep its leaves for later in the fall. And Chinese privet is considered a semi-evergreen or evergreen type tree. So we're just trying to see, when is it photosynthesizing? So I'm able to do that with this really cool machine that's actually sometimes not so cool, but it's still really cool because it's measuring my photosynthesis for me. And so it clamps onto the leaf and measures its known CO2 going into the chamber, and then whatever it doesn't use, whatever it's put out. And then of course it's got its light transmission on the leaf in different segments starting at 12,000 to like 0. And so I've got 2 sites actually in the southern Clemson experimental forest, and I'm testing the interior of a deciduous forest and the exterior edge type habitat that Chinese privet pops in at, and just trying to see what the difference is and see if Chinese privet is taking advantage of not having any sort of like leaves in the overstory of deciduous forests. So predictably, we're thinking it's probably photosynthesizing when we don't have an overstory cover. And of course, edge privet tends to be much bigger and bushier, and they're probably just like hanging out and sequestering carbon on a regular basis just because it has that ability to do that. And of course, the interior ones might still be photosynthesizing during the summer, but I don't know. That's what I'm trying to find out. So I haven't done any analysis because I'm in the middle of doing it all. I actively have to go and hang out on a ladder and measure my Chinese privet. And so hopefully I can get some ANOVA tests to test the difference between interior and exterior, the seasonality, and if there's any sort of differences between my 2 sites. And R hopefully will help me do that. But hopefully in all, I will be able to get more information about this highly invasive species. No such thing as eradicating it. It's everywhere, but much more vulnerable areas. Hopefully we can get a handle on it to get rid of it or at least decrease its numbers to reduce its ecological and economical impact on our deciduous forests. That's my project. You guys have any questions?
So it seems like your results might help us to determine the best time of year to attack this plant, you know, so if we know that they are doing a lot of photosynthesis before the leaf out happens, when they're the only thing leafing out, maybe we know that that's a good time to hit them with herbicide or remove them and have fewer resprouts.
Yeah, so that's hopefully what we're getting at. If it's not photosynthesizing during the spring or fall, and that's when you're actually attacking it, what's the point in putting the herbicide on it?
Right. I'd like to know that because I have a lab where I make the students do that every spring.
Yep, I was in that lab.
That's great. Any other questions for Trish? Again, no one has done it, but I encourage you to type a question in the chat box for us to address at the end of this session. For now, we can go on to Chip, and then last we'll have Hunter if you want to emotionally prepare yourself.
Hey everyone, I'm Chip, and let me pull this thing up here. Alrighty. So historically in the southeast, particularly in the coastal plain, we had between somewhere 90 million to 93 million acres of pine savanna, which was maintained by large herbivores such as buffalo and lightning ignited fire, in conjunction with fire ignited by Native Americans. However, at the time of European settlement, cattle were introduced to the landscape, and settlers also used fire and grazing to maintain the understory of the pine savanna. However, during the middle 1900s, fire was suppressed from the landscape, as well as cattle were shifted to the western part of the United States. So the study that we have just started down at Nemours Plantation in Beaufort County is to determine the effects of seasonal prescribed fire on forage production in this pine savanna. We've set up the site, as you can see here in my burn map. It's a 16-acre unit, and each unit is plus or minus an acre. We're going to apply fire at 3 different times of the year: during the dormant season, the early growing season, and the late growing season in September, which will also be tested against a control. We're going to do 3 samples in each plot. My first preliminary samples have already been taken in early May, and they're currently sitting in my office in Lahosky, as I can't get access to them to put any data together. But after 3 burns this year, we're going to go back in the middle of the growing season next summer and take additional samples to determine the protein, soluble protein, and the standard minerals. We expect that fire should make the vegetation more palatable, as well as more nutrient dense with regards to protein for cattle. The benefits that landowners should receive from this is the potential for having an annual revenue stream in their pine savanna, and is with selling cattle, as well as potentially leasing out the pine lands. This study is taking place at Nemours Plantation, and hope to get back in there after all this corona's done and get some more burns in. Also, this burn ban by the Forestry Commission is going to kind of hinder our May burn unless we can get past it. But thank you, everyone. Does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, Chip, I got a question. This is going to be kind of dumb. But last semester, we had a guy from the University of Florida who came, and he gave a talk. He's a mammalogist. And he said that mammoths likely played a large role in the development of the longleaf pine ecosystem. Have you read anything about that? And
yes, I have. I have read some stuff about that. And it's all very interesting. And
any chance of getting elephants
I've come across some
Nemours?
guys that are actually using cattle in their pine savannas, and what they're seeing is a extreme diverse ground cover with when the cattle are used in conjunction with fire. Something about the hooves and the how they disturb the soil, and also when and there's also benefits to wildlife. The grazing animals, they reduce the grass component to the ground cover, while they increase the forbs, which are more beneficial to wildlife, including game birds such as quail and turkeys and other ground birds like that. So I think that and we expect that fire with conjunction with cattle could be a great management tool for quail plantation owners as well. In addition to the economic stream.
Mm.
Hey, Chip.
Any chance you guys can run some elephants out there?
So Nemours is actually they're looking at getting cattle within the next couple of years and hopefully continuing this study, you know, with throwing the cattle into the mix. And they've even, Dr. Wiggers has even talked about maybe getting bison, you know.
Oh, that'd be cool.
It would be cool, yeah. Did you have a question, Hunter?
Yeah. So, what burn period do you think will have, kind of piggyback off the last question, will have the least impact on quail, and which one do you think will have like the most impact? You know, compared to like nesting season and kind of brood rearing, kind of going into the fall.
You know, there's a lot of research out there that sort of evaluates the damage that fire can do during the nesting season, which would be, you know, kind of that early growing season period in May. But I think it's important to have a diverse sort of burn mosaic on the landscape, you know. Traditionally, most lightning induced fires would have been in the early to mid growing season. And you know, land managers in the recent past have been burning mostly during the dormant season. But I think that a lot of these savanna type ecosystems would have evolved with more growing season burns. And you know, the bobwhite quail being a fire adapted species would be able to survive with that type of fire regime.
For sure. And I guess when you're doing more like block burning, or are you kind of experimenting with ring burning as well, or?
Yeah, with these little units, ring burning can be pretty easy to pull off, you know, particularly when you've got, you know, a burn that's already been conducted on one side. But it was so moist we got our first burns done in March, and it was so moist that we had a really hard time carrying fire across all the plots.
Chip, I've burned on Nemours, and we did rings as, you know, on all pine stands, because they just go up no problem.
Yeah, it's such a small unit, you know. I mean, my units are
great for working on
between like 9/10 of an acre all the way up to you know, 1 1/3 acre, and a ring fire I think is appropriate because you're not going to get great intensity towards the middle of the stand. Anything else?
Okay, thank you, Chip. I see we have a few questions waiting, and I encourage you to type some more. We're going to go ahead and let Hunter present. He's our last presenter for today, and then we'll cover a few questions. Thanks. If you might have to exit yours before. Oh, Hunter's doing it.
Are we good? Can everyone see that? Perfect.
Yes,
All
we're
right,
good.
my name is Hunter Morton. My project is basically restored and lost tradition in African American culture. So kind of get a little background, it's basically looking at the involvement and the impact African Americans have had on training bird dogs in the South. Is my focus, as well as the nation, kind of looking at how African Americans have trained kind of going forward in the future. So since we kind of have about 5 minutes, so I'm going to break it down into my topics and themes to kind of give a big overall grand scheme of what I'm looking into. So one of my topics is basically bred to do the job, people and dogs. So the English Pointer, which is one of the top breeds that a lot of plantations use for training and for doing their plantation quail hunts, is basically their main breed of dog. And before that, they actually used a sow, a pig that they would basically use until she was too heavy to use out in the field, and then they would have her slaughtered and eaten. And so then they brought the English Pointer over from Spain and basically bred those dogs to do what they were kind of born to do. A lot of people use English Pointers, and a lot of African Americans go to that dog as one of their key dogs because of their endurance, their drive, and their heart. And so I kind of look at that, and also look at, you know, the fact that African Americans were brought over as slaves to work on these plantations to do plantation work. And so kind of seeing those correlations there, and kind of how African Americans have chosen that dog to do their work, and kind of be the forefront of the dogs they go out to do the work for the plantation. A core group that I'm looking at is in the South, and they're the Georgia-Florida Dog Handler Shooting Club. And it's the African American group. And a big thing that I've seen going to look at their group and being interacting with their group is their family and legacy. So a big part of my research is looking into the history of training dogs in the African American culture, and going back into slavery times where there were a lot of African Americans training dogs. Those are the ones who were training the dogs for the plantation owners to come out and bring their colleagues to hunt on the plantation wagon. Basically their jobs were to handle the mules, handle the dogs. Basically all of the work that went into the hunt were put on the African Americans. So looking at that legacy and understanding why African Americans today continue to do that job, and learning what their motivations are, learning why they enjoy doing what they do, is a key to learning that family legacy and hearing their stories as why they became passionate about their work. And then thirdly, is one of the core aspects I feel is the quote a lot of them use is real dog men or dog men, and I kind of correlate that to someone that's wants to do that job. There are a lot of people that are interested in training bird dogs and hunting quail, but it's a lot of work and it's a lot of time. And in order to do it really well, you have to have the knowledge, experience, and the skills to do that. And so a lot of times you'll hear African Americans refer to folks that they learn from as real dog men because of the way they can handle the dogs, because of that bond that they have with those dogs, and just the way they can control the dog in the field. From a horseback that may be 300 yards away, being able to control them and have them hunt for them and not for the dog's self. So having that real dogman aspect, you have to have that passion for the sport and the willingness to work to kind of get to where you're going. I also looking at the training methods then and now versus the dogs as well, because back then a lot of them have voiced their opinions on how dogs were bred to run much harder, to last longer braces of hunts. And today's time is kind of the impact has changed a little bit. So the dogs they're still good dogs, but they're much better back in the olden days than they are now. And as well as training methods, today we have e-collars where, if a dog is out there 300 yards away, we have a method to control him. Whereas then, it was all hands-on training. So looking at the differences there, learning, what many of African Americans saw as necessary to train those dogs in order to do that job. And then looking now, as a lot of people view those kind of methods as harsh, but you kind of got to get their mindset as well. Kind of growing up and living on a plantation and working for a plantation, they have the mindset of it's either them or the dog, referring to their life, because if the dog goes out there and they have a rough training day, that dog is punished because eventually that plantation owner will punish that African American slave for not training the dog properly. So they really cracked down on how they were trained, which dogs were able to stay on the grounds and be plantation dogs and really go out and hunt. And a lot of people view that as harsh today in today's time, but learning and kind of putting yourself in their shoes and understanding, where they were coming from. Sometimes the ends justify the means. And then kind of fifthly, running while Black, basically discrimination in the sport. I'm one that has been I do a lot of testing and field trials in the upstate and learning the history and the struggles that African Americans in the South especially have gone through to be able to be where they are. It's pretty insightful just to learn how a lot of people basically said you will never win a trial because you are Black. And so understanding the discrimination there and figuring out, just how many African Americans were discriminated in that way, learning basically what they had to go through in order to make themselves noticeable in the sport. there's one man that he worked in South Carolina. His name was Ben Rand, and it took the National Bird Dog Association, I think it was around 60 years to put him in the Hall of Fame, whereas most times it only takes a few because of the color of his skin. And so understanding that there are just as many influential African American trainers out there that don't have the credit and don't get the credit that they should. So understanding the determination that goes into the sport that kind of drives African Americans to do their job at the highest level because they have to. And then lastly, understanding the term broke. So a lot of bird dog handlers and trainers use the term broke as referring to a dog that does everything it needs to do. So that dog is basically finished, where it'll point the bird, stay there through the flush, through the shot, go get a retrieve, come back spotless. So they say that dog is broke. And after talking with one of the participants, he didn't like the term broke, and I asked him why, and he basically said, he refers that back to when plantation owners were breaking slaves, basically making them do plantation work. When there was a rebellious slave that didn't want to do that, they had to break them in order to do that job. And so kind of understanding what these certain terms mean, the connotation to those terms, because a lot of people still to this day have a negative connotation towards plantation, and it's the word plantation. And so understanding how to get African Americans that are young into the sport, to build that diversity pool, as well as kind of understanding our history is the main part of my research. And so I kind of want to document it and kind of give voice to the African American trainers that have done this for so long but haven't been given the credit. That is all of my research. If you had any questions, that'd be great.
Hunter, it's fascinating stuff to look into to research. I'm curious. It seems like such a very unique story. And is there other examples of this in the world that you can go off of as a way of further exploring the story, or is this? I'm having a hard time, say of what to say, but it's just really fascinating. If you'd come across other examples like this.
Definitely. So my core group is, like I said, the Georgia-Florida Shooting Dog Handlers Trial, our club in Thomasville, Georgia, and South Georgia, because that's where plantations really still are, and so that's where the hub for quail is in the South area. And so they actually have a trial in March that I was able to go to right before all the COVID-19 kind of happened. But basically, it's their trial happened because they weren't allowed to run in the plantation owner white trial years ago. So they began to start their own trial. So they bounced to a different plantation each year. And so each year there are, I would say, probably 100 people out there, African Americans and white people that have come to view this event, because it is such an event that a lot of people want to see. So you're able to talk to a lot of people at that event through the trial there. But I'm also tapping into the plantations here in South Carolina to learn those stories from African Americans that have been on the plantation for 40 years, that may know their granddaddy or your great grandfather may have worked on the plantation and trained dogs. So learning their stories, as well as kind of just piecing together African Americans that have a tie to these plantations and kind of understanding their stories. So it is a hard group to target, just because there's not, and a lot of them have their core groups, their focus groups that are you have to find them in order for you to kind of get the insight and the stories that you need. But through kind of connection and networking, you end up starting to patch together where these groups are to be able to target the information that I'm trying to get out.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, Hunter, you had a question from Megan, but I feel like you just sort of addressed it. She says it's a super interesting topic. She's wondering how difficult it is to find historical sources. about this topic and how difficult it is to find sources from the African American perspective. I think you kind of just covered that in answering your, do you have anything else you'd like to add?
I guess the only thing I'd add to that is I did, so I sent out a few surveys back in December, and one of the methods I did that was I basically went on Facebook, and there's a group called the Black American Outdoorsmen, and so I got a lot of participants from that group just from social media and kind of targeted them that way. So I probably got about 50 or so participants from the social media way to be able to target them in my surveys, and then kind of down the road target some of those that I want to interview. I have kind of a pool to choose from, so I did kind of go that route as well.
Cool. Okay, if you guys think of any other questions for Hunter, feel free to type them in the chat. We have two other questions here. The first is for Trish from Jeremy. Trish, how might the timing of pine plot harvest influence the growth potential of privet?
So privet doesn't grow under pines, actually. And so that's why we're thinking extended phenology under deciduous forests is giving them that added advantage to invade. So it's not very common for them to be under pines. I actually have a plot that has a pine plantation, like right next to the forest road, where it's deciduous over here and then it's pine over here, and there's no privet in the understory. It might grow on the edge, but it's not in the understory.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you.
Okay, the next question is for you, Jeremy, from Keith. He says, sorry if it's redundant. Did you conduct your spatial analysis in ArcGIS, or did you do it in R? What's the benefit to using your spatial methodology?
I actually did it in both ArcGIS and in R. The initial analysis was actually what's called a globally weighted regression, which you can do in Arc, but it's more just it's much more exploratory and is a little more buggy, and so that's why we switched to a much more complicated, like Bayesian Poisson model. And so, yeah, getting into that would be a personal conversation, but the cool thing about the spatial methodology is, we know things about spatial autocorrelation, that things closer to one another are more likely to be related than as further apart. And so what is hard to model is how does it, as we move in space, does this one maybe independent variable affect a dependent variable as they're both changing? And so it's taking just these normal static statistic models and making them more dynamic to be able to vary in space. And so it's just getting closer and closer to truth. As getting closer and closer to truth, those models get more and more complex typically. So that's the good thing about this methodology.